All right. So it seems that kind of slowing down the number of people coming on. So I'll start with the introduction. So good morning, everyone. So most of y'all probably know I'm Sarah Schweitzer, the Assistant Chief in the Division of Wildlife Management over the Wildlife Diversity Program. And I welcome y'all to our January edition of our Science Communications webinar. I'm our division's representative on the research committee, and I'll be your host today. A couple of reminders just to keep your cameras off and your microphones muted during the presentation. And if you have any questions as we go along, you can put those in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Today we have Doug Howell, Wildlife Resources Commission's Doug Howell, who's going to present the history and status of resident Canada geese in North Carolina. But first, let me give a brief introduction for Doug. Doug received his Master of Science in Wildlife Management from the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. In fact, I was there as faculty when Doug was there. And currently he's the agency's expert on migratory game birds. Doug has been with the agency for more than 2 decades, and he is the migratory game bird coordinator in the Division of Wildlife Management. He's responsible for agency programs affecting all species of migratory game birds in North Carolina. And he ensures that these programs are in coordination with the other North American flyways through cooperative agreements, programs, and joint ventures with which the agency is involved. He is currently the chair of the Game Bird Technical Section for the Atlantic Flyway and serves on several committees in the Game Bird Technical Section. He also facilitates the development of management plans, regulation packages, and policies, and he evaluates effects of management actions on migratory webless game birds and waterfowl species in North Carolina. Doug is also an avid bird hunter, and he believes strongly that species biologists benefit from hunting the species they are responsible for. Of course, that wouldn't work well for me and some of my staff since we have listed species on our plate, but it is a good philosophy overall. With that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Doug. Share your screen.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Let me get my screen shared. I'm going to turn my camera off during the presentation. All right, well, I'll jump right in here. As Sarah mentioned, the title of my talk is really going to cover how we came to have resident Canada geese in North Carolina, and then some of the things we've done over the years to try to understand the status of those geese and you know, trends in that population over time. And with that said, I think we could just as easily, I could have just as easily titled this presentation as A Tale of Two Goose Populations, the demise of one and the rise of another. And I think that'll become apparent as we go through particularly the first half of the presentation. But go ahead and jump in here. So, you know, I'm going to take you back. You know, it really is a storyline. I'm going to take you back to the early 19th century and just talk about what we're talking about in terms of geese. At that time, there were no resident geese. We didn't have those. The only geese we had in the state were what we call Atlantic population Canada geese, which, as you can see from the map, breed in the northern part of Quebec and the Arctic, particularly around the Ungava Peninsula. So people that hunted geese back during the early half of the 20th century, that's what they were hunting. They probably didn't even know what we called those geese as a population, but they knew they came from Canada, and lots of them wintered in North Carolina. And at this time, you know, unlike today, duck hunting wasn't really, you know, people duck hunted, but most ducks that were shot were likely incidental to people's goose hunting. So, and unlike today, goose hunting seasons were not as widespread and long-term as we see today. Most of the goose hunting we had back in that time period would occur during December and January. So how did people hunt geese back in the early part of the 20th century? Well, we had a lot of guides back then that took people hunting, but most people that hunted geese would have a domesticated flock of geese in their backyard. Some people had 4 or 5, others had hundreds, but the typical goose hunt would be to take these domesticated geese who were actually trained to call at wildfowl as they flew over and past them. They would begin to call, uh, and so they were actually live decoys. So they would pack those up in crates and put them in their boat or their car or whatever, and take those out to the field and stake those geese out to call as geese pass by or ducks pass by, and drew them into gun range. So in 1935, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act actually made the use of live birds as decoys illegal. So what did people do with these geese they had in their backyards and these flocks? Well, they just let them go. So technically speaking, the first resident geese in the state were likely remnants of these live decoy flocks that were released into the wild and became, basically just geese on the landscape at that point. They likely, we don't really know how many geese were released, but it was primarily in the coastal plain. But those geese probably survived, or their progeny probably survived over several decades. It's hard to find a lot about, or at least pictures of what was occurring during the war years, during the 40s. But I went back to family photo album and found this picture of my grandfather, who's there on the right, Jerome Crumbly. He returned from the war, and we think this picture was taken probably either in 1948 or 49, because we know he got his first hunting dog, his first at least Labrador Retriever that time. You can see him there in the back seat. And this is what people did back in the day. They just, I can remember him talking about most people just hunted out of their car. They threw their few goose decoys in the back seat and their dog, and off they went hunting. So this is fairly representative of what would have occurred back in the 1940s. And remember, again, duck hunting was incidental to goose hunting. You can see looks like a mallard there in the center of that string of geese that were harvested. And we think this picture was taken. He spent a lot of time in Hyde County, so this was likely taken either in Hyde or Terrell County, probably around 1948. So moving into the 1950s and 60s, this was really the heyday of goose hunting in North Carolina, and it's the eastern North Carolina, particularly the northeastern part of the state, around Lake Mattamuskeet. It's often referred to as the goose hunting capital of the world. And you can see from these pictures, this on the picture on the right and the left, that's Percy Carowan. He was a fairly famous guide and decoy carver back during that time. And during that time, the refuge, I'm coming off a cold, so bear with me. The refuge actually allowed guides to operate on Lake Mattamuskeet. You can see his blind there on the lake there on the picture on the right. So what goose hunters during the 50s and 60s didn't know is what was about to change. Excuse me. So this trend line you're seeing here represents the number of migrant geese, or AP geese, observed in North Carolina during the annual midwinter aerial survey, which started back about 1960. As you can see, that population began to decline through the 60s, and even with restricted bag limits, the population continued to decline to the point the season was closed in 1986 on goose hunting and during the winter in North Carolina. Excuse me. So we think that's largely an artifact of overharvest. stepping back and looking, after the fact. And then combined with years of poor reproduction. Hopefully I'll get my voice back here in a minute, so bear with me. So, when that season was closed in 1985, that population really never recovered, particularly in terms of the numbers wintering in North Carolina. They just didn't come back. They began to, basically winter in the mid-Atlantic, particularly in Maryland. And so even today, we see less than 10,000 of those migrant geese in the state during the winter. So what does all this have to do with resident Canada geese? Well, the commission, largely as a result of this decline in migrant geese populations, they wanted to kind of augment our hunting opportunities. So they directed staff to actually go and find some geese and bring them back to North Carolina. So a stocking program occurred during 1983 through 1988. And we actually went and up to New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Virginia, even as far north as southern Ontario, and actually captured nuisance geese during the summer and trucked those back to North Carolina and let them go. And so these geese, they did migrate. They became permanent residents, and that really was the backbone of our present day resident goose population. And, because we're good wildlife managers in this agency, we wanted to, keep track of this population and monitor its spread across the landscape over time after this goose stocking program. So between 1986 and 2009, we had 3 efforts to try to estimate the size of the resident goose population. And however, this wasn't based on a standardized ground or aerial survey. We just asked the district biologist to tell us, how many geese do you have in your district? And then we compiled those numbers and came up with a population estimate. So over the next few slides, I will illustrate how the resident goose population increased from about 5,000, just after the stocking program began, to over 100,000 in 2009. So here's a picture from 1986, a map from 1986. As you can see, there were generally thought to be about 5,600 resident geese at that time. Most of those, as I mentioned, an artifact of our goose stocking program. Most of those geese were located where they were originally stocked in the coastal plain and in the Piedmont. And you can see that over half the counties in the state had no geese at all. So 12 years later, except for a few western counties, resident geese were breeding statewide and were estimated to number, almost at 100,000 birds. So you can see these numbers really exploded across many of the Piedmont and foothills counties. Also, by this time, we were starting to have resident Canada goose seasons to try to keep this population under control. Although, the bag limits we saw back in 1998 weren't anything like we see in September now. We did the flyway, all the states in the flyway began to hunt Canada geese around the late 90s in September. So by 2009, the district biologist told us we probably had over 100,000 resident Canada geese statewide. And this distribution you're seeing here is likely fairly similar to what we see today. And I will point out that this was the first year in 2009 that the Atlantic Flyway began to allow very liberal bag limits, because we were seeing this exploding trend of geese across the landscape, not only in North Carolina, but all the states in the Flyway. So bag limits were very liberal. Beginning in 2009 at 15 birds daily, and then to aid in increasing harvest, we also were allowing what we called additional special methods of harvest, and this included the use of unplugged guns, the use of electronic calls, and allowing people to shoot a half hour after sunset, where normally, we would cut off hunting 30 minutes before sunset. So a concerted effort across the flyway to try to keep these geese under control. So 5 years later, it was time to kind of do the same thing, trying to figure out how many geese we had. But, we were pretty clear that we were getting a lot or spending a lot more time on complaints, nuisance complaints. We didn't have the HWI call center at the time. We would get calls, the DBs would get calls, I'd get calls, and we were spending a lot of time on those. At the same time, as I mentioned, we were seeing more liberal goose seasons, more liberal bag limits and harvest methods, and generally what we saw were increased goose harvest. So we felt like it was probably a turning point in time where we really needed to think about what we were doing and maybe base our next estimate on what we would consider a standardized population survey method. So as a result, we were able to acquire funds to contract with NC State University in 2014 to evaluate two methods to estimate the resident goose abundance in North Carolina. Oops. Okay, so the first of those methods, I'll just call the band return estimation or leg band recovery estimation. So to actually do this, what we need is first a banded sample of resident Canada geese across North Carolina that were captured during the breeding season. Obviously, that would be upon WRC staff to do that. Then we would need hunter recoveries of that banded sample during the hunting season following the month of banding, and obviously our goose hunters would be the player there. We would need an estimate of total resident goose harvest in North Carolina from the hunting season following banding, and we get that, as you know, from the Federal Harvest Information Program. And then finally, we would need some estimate of, the band reporting rate. The band reporting rate is just the rate at which hunters who shoot a banded goose report that to the federal government where we have a record of it. And for Canada geese, it's lower than for ducks, but we know from what we call reward band studies that rate is about 73%. So with all that information in hand, we're able to use a fairly simple, what we call a mark recovery estimator, to generate a population estimate, which is primarily based on the relationship of total resident goose harvest to the harvest rate. So in 2014, the first of those methods was evaluated, and we captured in June around 2,000 adult geese at 44 sites, which resulted in 173 band recoveries. The second of those methods we call a plot survey. Basically, it's fairly simple. First thing we do is in GIS, we just lay a grid of cells or 1 square kilometer plots, as we call them, over the state of North Carolina, which resulted in about 104,000 plots statewide. And then what we did is we pulled a random sample of those 104,000 plots, sufficient to generate what we would consider a precise population estimate. So we randomly pulled out 300 of those 1 square kilometer plots to actually go during the breeding season and visit and determine the number of geese in each of those 300 plots. And so just simple math from there, we can generate a population estimate just by multiplying the mean number of geese observed in those random plots we sampled by the total number of plots, the 104,000 in North Carolina. So that was actually done in 2015. And so when we had the graduate student compare the two methods, if you look at the tables on the left, you can see that in terms of staff hours and total cost, that both estimation methods were fairly similar, although the band return estimator required a little bit less staff time and wasn't quite as expensive, but again, fairly similar. And then as you move down and look at the estimate itself, the estimates were fairly similar. around 150,000, 155,000 geese statewide. But what we saw was very apparent to us that the band return estimator was very precise when the plot estimate was not. So that kind of told us that's probably the estimate we needed to use going forward, or the procedure we needed to use going forward. But we also wanted to look at the human factor, and it was pretty apparent, from talking to staff that actually went out and did the plot survey. They hated it. It's you go visit a plot, you don't see anything, and it just people just didn't feel like they were a part of the actual effort. But the band return estimator, everybody was getting their hands on geese, everybody was involved, everybody felt more a part of the actual process. And generally speaking, people had a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Those who have done it, it's a lot of work, but it is a lot of fun at the same time. So our decision at the end of this graduate experiment or evaluation was that we would continue estimating goose abundance using the band return estimation method. But it was such a big effort and cost so much money that we didn't feel, as population managers, I didn't feel like, we really needed to do this annually. That's something we could repeat maybe every 3 years. So that's what we decided to do, and what we've done going forward since 2014 to estimate, except for the COVID years. I think we skipped a year there, but generally speaking, we go out every 3 years and repeat this band return estimation procedure across the state. So this map here, this is actually showing the locations of our goose capture sites across the state during the 4 years we banded: 2014, 2017, 2021, and 2024. And our overall goal is to band at least 2,000 adult Canada geese at these sites spread across the state. And the reason we came up with 2,000 geese, we did some statistical power analyses, and it told us that, to get the required precision, the estimate we were looking for, then we needed to band at least 2,000 geese statewide. We also recognize, that capture sites really aren't all the same, as you move across the landscape. And certainly that probably would have an effect on the band return rate, or number of band recoveries we got from these different types of sites. So the first type of site that we characterized were what we would call rural sites. This is pretty typical. Farm Pond, this is from McDowell County, that's where you usually see geese, in the rural landscapes. There's a pond, there's geese. So, and then, of course, those of us that are familiar with goose problems, they generally occur, at these what we call urban suburban sites, like this Raleigh neighborhood. So those are the two types of sites that we classified as our capture sites, recognizing that, the band recoveries probably wouldn't be the same between those two sites. So what we did is we asked the district biologist to locate, and this is the same map I showed you previously, but broken down into urban, suburban, and rural sites. So what we asked the district biologist to do when they were locating capture sites is to recognize that we needed to have, probably a good representation of each of those types of sites across the landscape. So we tried to get the district biologist to, find 50% of our sites at urban locations and 50% of our sites at rural locations. And I know probably quite a few of you have participated in goose banding over the last 4 efforts, but I know there's probably just as many people on this call that haven't. So I'm going to just kind of go through the logistics of how we pulled this off. It's a pretty big project. So obviously the migratory game bird program is part of the game and fur bearer program. So what we did originally is we decided to split our program in half and send 2 banding crews to travel across the state. one crew would be responsible for the western counties, and the other crew would be responsible for the eastern counties. And we'd start the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state and kind of meet in the middle, so to speak. But what we were responsible for in terms of logistics was we would lead the actual capture effort at each of these capture sites, and then we would be responsible for anything associated with banding and data collection. And then we tasked operations, as we call it now, particularly our district biologists, to locate molting geese in their district ahead of the traveling crews, and then make sure, as I mentioned previously, that we had a good representation of urban, suburban sites and rural banding sites across the landscape. And then one of the other really critical functions that the district biologists serve and continue to serve is to coordinate with Land and Water Access to actually get the manpower we need to pull this off. So with that said, Land and Water Access plays a really critical role in terms of manpower. They also provide a lot of our equipment, particularly our kayaks for roundups, and they're primarily responsible for handling geese and getting geese that we've captured to the actual banders. And I'll follow up on that in a minute. It'll become a little bit clearer. But I would like to mention also that we have other divisions that are involved as well, or other programs, wildlife diversity, for example. Enforcement has been, always providing help to us across the state. And then we generally have a good many volunteers, and a lot of students, that are, NC State students, for example, that are in, wildlife or some type of conservation program. So we have a whole host of people, from the game and fur bearer folks to operations to Land and Water Access to other programs, across divisions, even Raleigh staff for that matter. So wanted to make sure we recognized everyone that's been involved over the last 4 efforts. So for those that don't know, geese have to replace their primary flight feathers once a year. And lucky for us, this happens in June during the breeding season. So after geese have nested and most goslings have hatched, they start to lose or replace their primary flight feathers, which, as I mentioned, is good for us because they can't fly during this time. So we're able to capture these geese fairly easily when they're flightless, basically just doing what we call a goose roundup. So I'm just going to go through, the field methods here. This is a visual representation of a capture or a goose roundup. This occurred at Isothermal Community College up in McDowell County. There were roughly 100, 150 geese hanging around this pond up on the bank. So what we do is we just send people around the pond and push those geese right into the water. And then we deploy kayaks, and the kayaks can get these geese, rounded up into a really tight little ball, as you see there. And they're able to push those geese anywhere we want them, up on the bank, so we can actually capture those using these netted panels, as you see in the picture in the upper part of the screen here. So once we have them on land, we're just able to slowly surround them with these netted panels, close in on them, and then we have them. So this is a picture of the geese that at the same site that we've put in these corrals. These corrals are very nice. These panels allow us, when we have large numbers of geese like this, what they want to do is pile up on one end of the panel, and that results in them, really, they can trample each other. So we're able to use these netted panels as corrals, separate them into groups of 40 or 50, as you can see here. And then, from there, we can take those geese, out of the corrals to the banders. So in terms of banding, the actual banding, we collect a good bit of information. Obviously, the band number is what we primarily use for our population estimation procedure. But we also are required to record some other information like species, the status of the bird, whether it's just banded and released, age, sex, and the date and location of banding. But what really requires the most time, as you know, you can't tell a male from a female, a male goose from a female goose just by looking at them. What you actually have to do is examine the vent or the cloaca. We call that a cloacal exam. So it's a very nasty job, as you can see, but what we're looking for is the actual sex organ, particularly the male sex organ, or, the penis, so to speak. And if they don't have a penis, then they're obviously a female. So it's like I said, it's a time-consuming part of the process, but it's a necessary function. This is a shot of a typical banding crew. This is from 2024, this past June. You can see that's typically the number of people we need at each capture site to get these geese rounded up and banded. And from a statewide perspective, it generally takes, more than 100 staff, and 100 staff spending over 2,000 hours locating and banding these geese statewide in 2024. But it's a pretty efficient operation, and we generally can get this done in 5 days. So banding 2,000 geese in 5 days across the state, we're pretty proud of that. It's become very efficient and using our time. So that really is a encapsulation of how we go about capturing and banding these geese. And so before I share the results, I did want to just mention that we had a good bit of feedback from staff on the band return estimation procedure, and there was some concern, and rightly so, that that geese were everywhere, and maybe this population estimation wasn't really necessary. But if the population is everywhere in the state and they're out of control, so to speak, then we need to know that. We need to know if some of our control methods are working or not. And then, the real concern, and I shared this concern, is that when we mark these geese at these urban suburban locations, are they going to actually move away from say Cary or Raleigh out to somewhere on the landscape where they can get shot? And I felt like they would, particularly in September, as agricultural operations started harvesting corn, soybeans, that these birds would move. But it was a legitimate concern. So just keep that in mind as I go through the results of what we know from the first 4 years of our banding. So as I mentioned, we really depend, this whole estimation procedure depends on leg band recoveries, particularly from hunters. And people encounter bird bands in many ways, in terms of bird banding in general, in North America, bird banding is administered by the U.S. Geological Survey's Bird Banding Lab. So when people encounter hunters, or even the public encounter birds with bands on them, they have a number, a unique identifying number on the band, and then there's some information there that encourages folks to report that band to the bird banding lab. We don't use the 1-800 number anymore. We did when we first started this project. So they could call a toll-free number and report the band and some auxiliary information, or they could go to a website and report their band, just to make reporting as easy as we could and get as many leg band recoveries reported as possible. But in terms of our population estimation, we really only use birds that are shot or found dead as part of that estimation procedure. But you can see, almost 90% of the birds that were recovered were either shot or found dead. So, although we had these other methods of recovery, 90% of what we needed were birds that were shot or found dead and reported by the public or by hunters primarily. So in terms of hunter band recoveries, between 2014 and 2024, we banded resident geese at 108 sites across the landscape. And while we don't have results from 2024 yet, this is primarily the capture sites in general. The 108 capture sites are from 2014, 2017, and 2021. But the point being that of those 108 sites, we got band recoveries from 71% of those. 77 out of 108 sites we got band recoveries from. So that's important, and we'll use that information because we can, going forward, sites that we've used in the past that aren't producing any band recoveries, we can drop those and replace those with new sites. So it's good information to have, but we were very pleased, at least I was, that we got that kind of those numbers of recoveries from the sites we were capturing geese at. But more importantly, as a population manager, I wanted to understand, based upon the band recoveries by month of hunting season. So this pie chart represents almost 2,000 band recoveries from hunting seasons, which is September through February from 2014 to 2024. And for reference, I've included our hunting season dates for 2024-25. So you can see in our special September season that occurs throughout the month of September that this is where we want to see a lot of harvest. We want to see this season's designed to direct harvest at these resident Canada geese with, as I mentioned previously, these liberal bag limits and these auxiliary methods like electronic calls, unplugged guns, and extended shooting hours. And then our regular Canada goose season occurs over about 80 days, 70 to 80 days. But you can see the bag limit there is not what it is in September. So what that's telling me as a population manager is that we're getting the result we're looking for. 36% of our band recoveries occurred during the month of September. And then, the other month you can see is January, and that's likely an artifact of having a lot of duck hunters on the landscape and they're shooting geese incidental to their duck hunting. But this was a result that we were looking for, and we're very happy about it, and we'll certainly want to continue this trend into the future. When we look at band recovery rates, this is a pretty important parameter to look at. The band recovery rate's pretty simple. It's just the total band recoveries divided by the total geese banded, and you get a rate there. But you can see that these vary across the state. District 9's relatively low, but they don't have that many geese, so that's understandable. But it's pretty consistent across the rest of the state. Our band recovery rate is about 29%. And what that tells us is that unlike birds that migrate twice a year from Canada and undergo, all that pressure, these high band recovery rates indicate that these resident geese are available on the landscape to hunters for a longer period of time. They survive longer because they're not migrating. Mortality rates aren't as high. So we have this really high band recovery rate compared to migrant geese. And that's another thing that we certainly wanted to see in the data that we collected. More importantly, we wanted to understand the band recovery rate by site type. As you can see, although the total band recoveries were less in urban suburban locations, which is intuitive, I think. Most of geese are, and most hunters in the rural landscapes, and most of our geese are in the rural landscape. So it makes sense that we didn't have as many recoveries at urban suburban sites as we did at rural sites. But what I'm particularly proud of, and it's a testament to our district biologists, is we banded almost the identical number of geese over that 10-year period in rural sites as we did in urban sites. So that's certainly something we were looking for. You can see the band recovery rate at rural sites is a good bit higher than it is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, than it is at urban suburban sites. But what that's telling us is that even these geese at these urban suburban sites are moving out of these urban locations to places where they get shot. And what's very interesting to me is if you look at the average distance from where they were banded to where they were recovered, it's fairly similar across the two sites. It's about 12 miles. So, and you can see in rural sites, that's the range is a little bit higher. We got geese that, for example, that were banded in maybe the western region of the state, moved over to the coastal plain, and same scenario with urban suburban locations. They move around, but on average, that distance from banding to recovery location is about 12 miles. And to represent that, maybe visually, this is a capture site, as I mentioned previously, at Isothermal Community College. And you can see the diamonds, or the triangles, excuse me, are recovery locations. You can see that, we have some birds that have gone out, way out east and got recovered, or pretty far north from the original banding location. But for the most part, the average distance to recovery is about 22 miles. Looking at an urban suburban site, this is Wake Med Soccer Park. This is as urban as you're going to get. It's right in the middle of Cary. So remember, this was a concern that these birds wouldn't go anywhere and get shot. But you can see they don't have to go that far from the middle of Cary, out into the landscape until they, encounter agricultural locations where they're cutting corn, so on and so forth. And again, the average distance to recovery was about 15 miles. So what does all this mean in terms of our population estimate? So this table shows our population estimates in 2014, 2017, and 2021. You can see the total number of geese banded in each of those years, the Fish and Wildlife Service harvest estimate, how many direct recoveries we had, and the band reporting rate, obviously it's the same. But all those calculations are fairly similar across those 3 years, anywhere from 150 to 155,000 geese statewide. And, the precision, the estimates, really pretty damn good, in my opinion. So what that's telling us is remember the concern that was expressed that geese are everywhere and, they're out of control. That's just not the case. It's just not the case. Our resident goose population is fairly stable over that 10-year period. And why is that? I think, I'll bring back that pie chart of recovery by hunting the month of the hunting season. We're harvesting these birds at a very, very high rate. Excuse me, I hung up here. So we're harvesting these birds at a very high rate. If you compare that harvest rate there to what we would consider a harvest rate that we would like to put, for instance, on other goose populations, particularly migrant goose populations, we like to keep the recreational harvest rate at below 10%, most of the time, around 5%. So, we're really putting the pressure on these birds, as you can see, with a 39% statewide harvest rate. And then, the other thing that comes into play, and we've noticed this over the banding efforts over those 4 years, that in some years we just don't catch any goslings. It appears that, and that's kind of consistent statewide, that reproduction just fails. And some years we get a lot of goslings, but in other years we catch very few. And so that's telling us that we're combining this high harvest rate with years of really poor production. 2024 was one of those. So unlike ducks, Canada geese don't do very well when, or unlike ducks, Canada geese aren't reproductively active until the third year of life. And they have a really tough time rebounding from years of poor production, particularly when we're putting the type of harvest, the type of high harvest rate on these birds, as we are in North Carolina. So, even though poor production is a result of many factors, natural and human induced, when you have poor production and a high harvest rate, that's really helping us keep the population under control. And then, the other control methods we have, and this particular one, what we call the Canada goose egg and nest destruction, allows landowners to take goose problems into their own hands through a very simple registration procedure and a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. People can go online, they can sign up, as they can sign up, and this allows them to go out, when they've got geese nested in their bushes, or when homeowners or even office buildings have problems with geese, they're allowed to go out there and just remove or destroy the nest and eggs themselves. So that's become much easier for the public. Used to, they had to go through a long, laborious process to actually get a permit to do that, but now it's very easy, and they just have to report once a year, how many eggs and nests they destroyed. So, on a statewide basis, with this becoming a lot more easy for landowners to take, these goose problems in their own hands, it can limit the number of goslings entering the fall population. So it's another big control method we have to keep this population under control. And then this is what I call commercialization of Canada goose control. People often want to take matters into their own hands, but they don't have time, or they can't do it themselves. Well, now we've seen the advent of these commercial operations that have the permits in hand, that can go out and assist landowners with either hazing geese during the breeding season, or, doing the egg and nest control themselves. So that's really evolved over the last 10 or 15 years. And then we've always had these other control methods, agricultural depredation, particularly early in the spring, in April and May. Farmers really get hammered by these geese as they go out in the fields and, just go down the row and pull up their soybeans. We're able to issue, as an agency, depredation permits to take some of those birds off the landscape. And then, when various control methods don't work, people can still request the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do lethal control when these other control methods are ineffective. So just to wrap all this up, Atlantic population Canada geese, the migrant geese I mentioned earlier, they really are in survival mode in North Carolina. We don't winter, more than about 10,000 of those birds annually. So resident geese are really the backbone of our hunting opportunities, but obviously they come with their own unique set of problems for the public. But we do have a management plan, and we have a management goal. Our goal is to keep the resident goose population at about 125,000 geese statewide. Unfortunately, we're probably never going to reach that goal, but we're not too far from it. So we hope that, the current control methods, particularly harvest, our big one, the egg and nest destruction, the hazing, the other depredation control measures we have for agricultural situations, and the lethal control outside the hunting season are enough to keep this population stable. But, it's unlikely that we'll ever not have to respond to goose problems. But if we can keep this population, where it is now, I think we're in good shape. So with that said, I guess it's time. I think we got about 10 minutes left for questions. I can take questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, sure. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll go through them. Okay, we got one in here from Chris Smith. What extent do depredation permits and USDA removals impact opportunities for hunters? To what extent?
That was really one of the reasons that we wanted to have a population estimate based upon a standardized survey method, so we can understand if we go the other way. Is I think that's where your question is. At what point may some of these control methods, particularly harvest, take our goose population to the point where it's actually we see a decline in opportunity. We haven't gotten there yet from what I see, but what we keep a close eye on it. So what we would do if we saw that these control methods that I mentioned were becoming so effective that we were losing opportunity, would likely first thing we'd likely do would be to lower the bag limit during the September season, cut that back a little bit. So I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
But we haven't seen that situation yet.
There's another question. Chris Mormon asks, are other states using the band recovery methods, and how do the results compare to North Carolina?
That's a good question. In the flyway, we have what we call every year the Atlantic Flyway Breeding Plot Survey. So all the states, with the exception of Maine, north of Virginia, are using the plot estimation method. I know Georgia and South Carolina, and I believe Virginia is even thinking about doing a band estimation procedure themselves. But at least in terms of Georgia and South Carolina, their numbers aren't what ours are, but they're close. Particularly Georgia. I think their last estimation was they thought they had around 140,000 birds. So those states that have done band estimation procedures to generate a population estimate, they're fairly similar to ours.
Okay, there's another question. Shannon Deaton asks, or says that you said that we're very dependent on harvest by hunters. How do you think we will be successful at letting hunters know and to keep the harvest steady each year? So this is a tool we can use.
Could you repeat that question? I'm not sure I understood the first part of
it. To control the population, we're dependent on the harvest by hunters. So how do you think we can be successful at letting the hunters know, how they contribute to this control, and how can we keep this harvest steady each year so it's a good control measure?
Right. Well, we've got many methods to communicate, our harvest to hunters. Our website includes harvest estimates each year for Canada geese. They can see, they understand just from communication with our program, or our migratory game bird program, how important they are, to achieve the control we're looking for. The second part of the question, in terms of how do we ensure that we continue to put this pressure on geese to keep this population stable, and well, that's a lot of states north of us, particularly in the Northeast, aren't able to do. They're losing hunters. So I think the answer to that would be to do everything we can to retain the hunters we have. Goose hunting's real popular in September, so anything we can do. And we do have programs, the 3Rs, we do have programs to make sure we retain, the hunters we have. So.
Okay, quick question for you. Does it drive you crazy when people call them Canadian geese?
Yeah, it does. I'll tell you what drives me crazier is I was talking about the band return methods, how people actually, get a band in hand, to report to the Geological Survey Bird Banding Lab. But we've got photographers now that just love to go out and photograph bands, and it just drives us crazy. We have to respond they'll get the numbers wrong. Most 90% of the time, the numbers, or 99% of the time, the numbers are wrong.
Hmm.
So that drives me more crazy than people saying Canadian geese, but it is what it is.
Yeah, yeah. And we only have 5 minutes left. What subspecies are there of Canada geese?
Yeah, we've got a mixed green salad of geese. We've typically got 4 subspecies. We've got Canadensis canadensis.
Hmm.
We've got Canadensis maximus. We've got, and I don't think I can recall the other 2. I think Canadensis laeus, and then, so basically we have a mishmash of birds from, the Eastern Arctic. We have a mishmash of birds from the St. James Bay area. We've got birds that were derived from the mid-continent. All those are in our resident goose. All those genetic components are in our resident goose population. So generally 4 subspecies of geese you can find in the genomics of our resident goose population.
Okay. Yeah, and then Fallon
That's
says,
why when you look at a flock of geese, some are really big, some are really small, some are medium sized, so it's all based upon where they originally came from when they were domesticated.
Yeah, that kind of answers Fallon's question about what we have here in North Carolina. So it sounds like a mix. Yeah, no, I do kind of wonder how far ranging they are, because I was over in England last summer and saw Canada geese. So have they introduced them elsewhere as well, or they just naturally move?
Well, yeah, they've moved from, in some cases from Greenland. We have quite a few resident geese or the same lineages in Greenland as we do here in the southern part of North America. So they likely came from there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate this presentation. This presentation is being recorded, so we're going to put it on our agency's YouTube, and that will be available to everybody. We'll send out an email to let you know when it's available, and you can share it with others. And I also want to let everybody know that in February, we'll have a presentation given by several Wildlife Resources Commission staff on impacts of Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina, and a little bit of update about that. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see y'all again in February. And thank you again, Doug. It was great.
Thank you. Thanks for attending.
Take care. Thanks.